All right, guys. Well, welcome to session 4 of God's Storyline. Where we left off last time was the Israelites had just been led out of slavery. They had crossed through the Red Sea, and they were celebrating their freedom, right? And so, if you are following along, again, we are the narrative of where we're at. We are breaking down this storyline into 6 acts of a play. We still find ourselves in Act 3 of the play. So this is our second week or second session in Act 3 of the play. And the Israelites, they found themselves free from slavery. And so that happens in Exodus 14. And then in chapter 15, we find them just celebrating their freedom. And then 16, 17, and 18 is a little bit of them and just their story and the narrative of them settling into life in the desert where they now find themselves. And again, at this point, there's a little bit of drama in the story. Again, God had promised to make them into a great nation. He had promised to give them this great land flowing with milk and honey where they were going to be. And now they find themselves in the desert. And so they're free from slavery, which is awesome, but they're not quite where they envisioned themselves being either. And so we pick up the story. We're going to pick it up. We're going to start reading in Exodus chapter 19. So if you have a Bible, again, I'm reading out of an NIV. I have a little bit older version, so there might be a few words that are different than what you have. But I'm reading out of the NIV. We're going to pick it up in Exodus 19. So let me pray for us, and we're going to dive in. God, thanks again for just the technology to do this, to be able to connect this way. God, we are grateful for your word, for the way you reveal yourself to us. So God, I pray that you would do that more and more, even through this session, that you would continue to teach us more and more about who you are and how you relate to us. And then God, ultimately we want to learn more and more about what that means for us as people made in your image, called to follow you. So God, I ask that you'd speak to everyone watching this individually, wherever they are, and whatever time frame they're watching this. God, would you show up? Would you meet them in the text? And would you show them what they need to see? So God, we love you. We thank you. It's in your son's name. Amen. All right, so we're going to start reading again, Exodus 19, starting in verse 1. Here we go. In the 3rd month after the Israelites left Egypt, on the very day they came to the desert of Sinai. After they set out from Rephidim, they entered the desert of Sinai. And Israel camped there in the desert in front of the mountain. Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called him from the mountain and said, "This is what you are to say to the house of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites." So Moses went back and summoned the elders of the people and set before him all the words of the Lord had commanded him to speak. The people responded together, "We will do everything the Lord has said." So Moses brought their answer back to the Lord. Right, and so if you go all the way back in the story, we have God making a covenant with one man, with Abram, who becomes Abraham, and he promises to make him into a great nation. And so eventually, as we track the lineage, that nation becomes the nation of Israel. And so here we have a nation of Israel. We have all of these people. They are numerous, as you can imagine. They are a full group of people. They are now freed from slavery. They are on their own. And here we see God offering the chance to enter into a covenant with him. Again, he already had one with Abraham. He is now offering to enter into a covenant with the entire nation of Israel. A couple things, just questions I think we should be asking ourselves as we read this. And the first one is simply, what does it mean that Israel will be God's treasured possession? Right, in verse 5 it says, "If you fully obey me and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession." Probably the best way I think to wrap your mind around this is to imagine that you are at home one night and you're sleeping and you wake up to the fact that your house is on fire. right? And so you wake up and you're kind of scrambling, and you only have time to grab 2 or 3 things out of your house so that you can make it out in time and stay safe. And the question is, what would you grab, right? If you had 2 or 3 things that you could get or take, and that's all you had time to do, what are the things that you would choose? Now, obviously, everything in your house is yours. You own all of it. It all belongs to you. And on some level, all of it is important to you, right? If you had the chance, you would save everything from your house because you care about all of it. But when push comes to shove, if you were forced to choose just a few things, the question is, what are the things you would choose? And whatever those things are, whatever comes into your mind, those are your treasured possessions, right? You value all of them. They all belong to you. But there's a certain few that probably just fall in a different category, right? Like mentally, they're just different. They're special. They are your treasured possessions. And so that's the first question we should ask. The next question I think we should ask is, why Israel? Right? Of all of the nations, all over the world, why did God choose Israel? It's a valid question, right? Perhaps it was because Israel was the largest of all nations, right? Maybe it was they were the largest, since they thought, well, I can have the biggest impact because this is the biggest nation, so I'm going to start with them. Another possible answer is because they were the strongest. Perhaps they posed the greatest military threat, and so as God decides, I want to conquer all of these disobedient nations around me, well, I'm going to choose Israel because they have the best military strength that I can use. Another possible answer would be because maybe they're the most moral, right? Of all the nations that exist, there's obviously immorality, as we learned in Genesis 3 through 11, right? It is just raining. The world is going downhill. Obviously, you see evidence of that in Egypt as they are oppressing people and turning them into slaves and worshiping false gods, right? So evil is reigning. Perhaps Israel is just the most moral of all the nations. And so God said, well, you guys are the most moral, so I'm going to choose you, right? So at Exodus 19, at this point, we don't really know why God is choosing them, right? We don't see all of that yet. I'm going to give you guys a glimpse of a couple passages in Deuteronomy that give us insight into that. So if you want to flip over to Deuteronomy, find your way to Deuteronomy chapter 7, and then we're going to look at a second passage in Deuteronomy chapter 9. And we're going to see what God says. Hey, God, why did you choose Israel? All the nations could have chose anyone. Why Israel? Here's what God says. Deuteronomy 7, verses 7 through 9. The Lord did not set his affections on you and choose you, because you were more numerous than other peoples, for you are the fewest of all peoples. But it was because the Lord loved you and kept the oath he swore to your forefathers, that he has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the land of slavery, from the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Know therefore, that the Lord your God is God, and he is the faithful God, keeping his covenant of love to 1,000 generations of those who love him and to keep his commandments. Flip over to Deuteronomy 9, chapter 9, verse 4 through 6. Deuteronomy 9, 4 through 6. And we read this. After the Lord your God has driven them out before you, do not say to yourself, the Lord has brought me here to take possession of this land because of my righteousness. No, it is on account of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is going to drive them out before you. It is not because of your righteousness or your integrity that you are going in to take possession of their land, but on account of the wickedness of these nations, the Lord your God will drive them out before you to accomplish what he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Understand then that it is not because of your righteousness that the Lord your God is giving you this good land to possess, for you are a stiff-necked people. So why did God choose Israel? Well, it's none of the reasons that we would choose a nation, right? We would choose them because they're the biggest, or because they're the strongest, or because they're the most holy. And God didn't choose them for any of those reasons. He chose them because he made a promise. Because you go all the way back to his promise that he made, the covenant that he made with Abram, who he renamed Abraham, right? Because of that promise, God is faithfully staying true to that. That is the only reason that he is choosing Israel to be his treasured possession. They are not special or unique in any way. In fact, they're probably inferior in most ways. The only thing that makes them special is that they are descendants of Abraham, who God made a promise with. That's the only reason, right? And so one of the interesting things, I think, the questions I want you guys, again, throughout this, we're going to try and put ourselves in the mindset of the characters that we're reading, right? I don't want you to read this entirely like people living in Act 5. I want to pause at moments and try and put ourselves in the shoes and the mindsets of these characters. So right now, the question is, if you are an Israelite and God offers to make you your treasured possession for the reasons that we just talked about, what does that teach you? Right? What are you learning? What is going through your mind if you're an Israelite and you're hearing these words from Deuteronomy? Well, reminds me, I think, of a couple things, right? Again, if I'm an Israelite, it reminds me that God is faithful to his promises, right? Hundreds of years have passed since he made this promise to Abraham, right? Since God said, I'm going to do this for you. I'm going to bless you and make you a great nation, more numerous than the stars in the sky, right? God walked through the animals. He made that covenant. He doubled down on his promise. And here, hundreds of years later, God is still faithfully following through. He is staying committed to his word, to what he said he would do, right? So one of the things this should remind us is the faithfulness of God. I think also, if I'm an Israelite, it teaches me that God is willing to use me even though I'm not perfect, right? God says very clearly, it's not because of your righteousness or your integrity, right? He calls the Israelites stiff-necked people. He's basically saying, you guys aren't really all that better morally. You're not morally superior. You're not more humble. You are a stiff-necked people, not a compliment. And yet, God is still willing to use them. God still chooses them, and God is still staying faithful to them. So again, if I am an Israelite, that teaches me a whole lot about God and his willingness to use me in spite of my flaws, right? There's a graciousness that we learn about God in this process. And the last thing I think it teaches me, if I'm an Israelite, is that it's also very humbling, right? We like to think of ourselves often as unique and special and different. And God kind of puts them in their place and says, hey guys, I didn't choose you because you were that special. I chose you because I'm staying faithful to the covenant, to the promise I made to your forefathers, right? And so there is a humbleness that I think should come over the Israelites as they hear this, just to be reminded, listen, God didn't choose me because I have impressed him and I've earned his favor. We've won him over because we're awesome. God's staying faithful to his promise. And we are lucky to be on the receiving end of that, to be his treasured possession, because we don't have to be, right? God could have chose someone else, but he's staying faithful to a promise. And so once you think through, what does this mean for you as an Israelite? Well, now we need to ask the question, as characters living in Act 5 of this play, right? Someone who hasn't come into the story yet, well, what are the implications that this could have on us and our characters, right? In some sense, it's the same thing, right? The God who stayed faithful to Abraham and who is staying faithful to the Israelites, well, I can trust that God is going to stay faithful to me, right? The same way that Abraham can trust his promises and the Israelites are still trusting his promises, well, that means that I can probably trust his promises too. It also reminds me that if God is willing to use an imperfect nation, a nation that is flawed and stiff-necked, and it's not because of their righteousness that he chose them. right? If God is willing to use a whole nation like that, well, good news, there's a good chance he's willing to use me and all of my imperfections too. Because God doesn't always choose us because of how awesome we are. He chooses us for his own reasons. And in this case, he chooses Israel because of a promise. So, first thing I think we just need to unpack is the treasured possession and why Israel. Next verse I think we need to dive into is in 19 verse 6. We already read this, but in 19 verse 6, find it again. God says, he says, although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And so the question is, what does that mean? What does it mean to be a kingdom of priests? Well, we don't have a lot of priests in Scripture at this point, but it doesn't mean priests didn't exist, right? There were priests are not something unique to the Israelites' God or the Christian God, as we will come to know him later in the story, right? Priests were in many religions, right? There were probably Egyptian priests when they were in captivity that they saw and maybe interacted with all the time. And so just in general, if you were to look up what is a priest is essentially a mediator. They are a go-between between God and humans. Right now, often that was for ritualistic purposes, but they are the person, right? Like you have humans over here, you have gods over here, and we need this mediator, someone in between to help make the connection for us. They're a middleman. They're the one who intercede on our behalf. And so when God says, you will be for me a kingdom of priests, he's looking for an entire nation that will function in that role, right? Not just one person, not just one leader, one priest. He wants an entire nation that functions as kind of the nation that stands between the world and God, right? Instead of just a priest who's doing that role, he wants an entire nation of people who are going to function as the people who connect all other nations and all other peoples. And they represent and they connect. They are the mediator, the intercessor for all of humanity to God. You will be for me a kingdom of priests. Right? And the kingdom is obviously everyone who is under the rule of a king, right? And in this case, that would be all of Israel as they submit to and sit under the kingship of God, right? Of Yahweh. And so as you're hearing this should remind you, right? You should echo back to Genesis 12. Like your brain should go back there quickly. And it should go back to the original call that God made and promised he made to Abram. He said, I will bless you and make your name great so that you can be a blessing to all nations. Right? And so what we read here in Exodus 19:6 is God makes this offer to enter into a covenant relationship with this nation. What he calls them to is the exact same thing he invited Abraham into. Right? I'm going to invite you and I'm going to bless you. I will give you privileges and rights and take care of you so that you can be a blessing to all nations. And here in Exodus 19, God is having the same interaction, the same basic discussion, but this time instead of with one man, it's with the entire nation of Israel. I want to make you my treasured possession. I want to value you and give you special place and privilege. But I also want you to be a kingdom of priests so that I can use you to bless all other nations. I want you to be this mediator, this go-between between the rest of the world and me. Kind of a pretty cool picture that God gives us. Now the second part of that verse, it says, and a holy nation, right? And so again, the question is, well, what does it mean to be a holy nation? And the answer, if you are Israel at this point, is I have absolutely no idea, right? Holy is a new term. It is a foreign concept. They do not know what it means to be holy. And so the question is, if you are God and you want a holy nation, how in the world are you going to teach them a brand new concept of what this means to a nation that is completely foreign to this concept. Right? This is the new idea. They are not familiar with this. They don't know how to understand this. They don't know how to live this out. Right? They have fallen like every other nation far from God. I didn't choose you because you were the most holy, because you're not. So how do you teach someone, let alone a whole nation of people, what it means to be holy? Kind of to put this in perspective for you, I want you to imagine that you are at church and you are teaching the 2 and 3 year old class. Right? You are a worker in the kids ministry. You're teaching the 2 and 3 year old class, and you get your lesson, and your lesson is to teach 2 and 3 year olds what does it mean to be holy. Right? That would be quite a challenge, right? As someone with small children, if I was trying to teach my kids that concept, that would be a hard concept to teach. Almost similar in recent weeks with everything that has been going on in our world, just trying to teach young children what germs are. How do you protect yourself from germs, right? And when you have a 2 or 3 year old, they don't quite grasp that concept yet, right? It takes time for them to start to understand as they grow and get a little bit older. Well, yeah, you shouldn't just lick the floor. You shouldn't do that sort of thing because there's germs on there. I know you can't see them, but there's things in there. It'll make you sick. Like, there's just concepts that when you are younger, you do not understand, and you have to be taught them. Exact same thing is true with Israel as a nation. They are a new nation. They are a young nation. They are brand new to what it looks like to be God's holy nation, and they don't know what that means. And so God gets to teach them. And so if you were God, how might you go about that? This is exactly why God gives them the law. Right? This is where the 10 Commandments come in. Right? The 10 Commandments come in immediately following. We're in Exodus 19, Exodus 20, 10 Commandments. Why does the law come in? Because he just invited them to be his holy nation, and they have no idea what that looks like. They don't know how to do that. They don't know how to live that out. They don't know how to fulfill that. They are starting from zero. So God gives them the law. This is why they have so many rules, because he needs to teach them what exactly it means to be holy, to be set apart. He needs to teach them the difference between clean and unclean, both physically, right? We take some of these things for granted. We just get this. You go back to this time and this culture, they did not understand germs and the difference between clean and unclean. Like, that was just a different world. They aren't there yet. And so God is trying to teach them things like the difference between clean and unclean, holy and unholy, both physically and morally, right? And so this is where the law comes in. This is why in Exodus and in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, you start to get all of these rules and all of these laws, because he is trying to teach them what this looks like. And as you start to read through some of these laws, one of the things it should do is it should take you back to the first 2 acts of our play. Right? In Act 1, God created this beautiful world that was functioning as it should be, right? All was right. Then we had Act 2, we had the fall. Everything is not right anymore, right? The beautiful world that God created is just starting to deteriorate. And remember the downward spiral, it's getting worse and worse and worse. And so as God introduces this concept of holiness, and he starts to institute laws and rules, all of these laws and rules, what they are is they are a guide to what life looked like pre-fall. Right? The law should teach them the opposite of the 4 falls. Every law that you can find in some way should teach you how to rightly relate to God, to your fellow human, to yourself, and to creation. Right? The 4 falls, the law is essentially the inverse of all of the falls. Every single law points you back towards this is how your interaction should look or would look if we were living in a pre-fall world. So one of the things that you're going to get to do this week is I'm going to give you an assignment. So you're not going to get a ton of these, but you get an assignment this week. You get a worksheet, super exciting, I know, that's going to give you 20 or 30 rules and laws that you're going to look up, and you should read them, and then we're going to have you put them in categories of how does this law point us back to pre-fall creation. Worksheet will explain all that and what it looks like, but you're going to put them in categories. Hey, this law is all about how I rightly relate to God. And this one is all about how I should rightly relate to creation. And some of these, they're actually going to fill multiple categories, right? Some of these, this law actually teaches me how to do all four at the same time, right? And so I think the better you understand how these laws connect back to what God originally created and the ways in which that was broken down in the four falls, these laws will start to make a little bit more sense. Again, these are God's guidelines. Hey, you are a new nation. I want to teach you how to be a holy nation that stands out, that is set apart from every other nation. So here's some guides into how to do that. And the better you can do this, the closer you will get to the pre-fall world that you were designed and created for. So that's coming. We're going to give you that worksheet. There'll be a link that you can click on to find that, print it out, whatever you need to do. The other effect that this the law is going to have is the law is going to reveal their sin. Right? So we start getting into all of these rules, all of these laws. Those are both helpful because it's like the owner's manual to your car. It tells you this is the proper way to operate it. This is the proper way to care for it. So it's beautiful in that sense. But it's also painful because it points out and it reveals all of the ways that we are failing to do that. Right? It is a constant barometer that will remind Israel just how far they are falling from being the holy nation that God is calling them and longing for them to be. Right? And all of that double-edged sword, again, it's beautiful because it's like the owner's manual that teaches you, man, this is the way to do it right. And it's painful because it reminds you, wow, look at all the ways you're falling short of this. And it's the second side, the painful side of that sword, which is actually going to lead us into our next session together. And our next session is all going to be all about atonement and forgiveness. Right? The book of Leviticus, which we will get to next, assumes that we are going to mess up, that we are going to fall short in our commitment to God. And Leviticus basically says, when you screw up, because you're going to, here's what you need to do. Right? And so again, this is the formal covenant that God offers to the nation of Israel. Exodus 19. We're going to read through it one more time just as we close out this session. Exodus 19, verse 1. In the 3rd month after the Israelites left Egypt, on the very day they came to the desert of Sinai, after they set out from Rephidim, they entered the desert of Sinai. And Israel camped there in the desert in front of the mountain. Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called him from the mountain and said, "This is what you are to say to the house of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites." So Moses went back and summoned the elders of the people and set before them all the words the Lord had commanded them to speak. The people responded together, "We will do everything the Lord has said." So Moses brought their answer back to the Lord. So again, if you haven't done it yet, go back, underline Exodus 19, verse 6. You will be for me a kingdom of priests and holy nation. Underline that verse. And again, God gives them this offer. Listen, I offer to make you my treasured possession if you are willing to fully obey me and follow me. If you are willing to become a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And in verse 8, the people respond together. They agree, they choose in, and this is the formal beginning of Israel as God's covenant people. And that's where we're going to end our session today.